Well, I was asked to talk briefly about why we should care about what is happening around the world and what can we learn from these other jurisdictions. I probably don't have to persuade you after you've heard what Michael and Kai-Ming have to say that there's a lot to be learned here. And I would point out that both Ontario and Hong Kong are states or provinces located within big national systems, much as the United States. So we have a governance relationship that is very similar, and I'm going to come back to that when we have a chance for some conversation. Obviously, reason number one is globalization. Everyone remembers Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, and in fact, we are in collaborative and competitive relationship with other countries and so on all of the time. And clearly the economy demands more and more education for more and more students of a different kind. And Kai-Ming did a great job of framing the fact that the kind of learning we're looking for is very different from what we have been trying to structure before. And that calls for education reform that is very different than what most nations have done before. And so looking to see how people are dealing with that is very, very important. The growth of demand for non-routine skills versus routine skills we've already heard about. Let me give you just one example of of how this manifests itself. Now, as a Stanford person, I don't usually like to quote people from Cal Berkeley over the bay, but every once in a while they do a study worth quoting. There are two guys over there who've been looking at this question of how fast is knowledge growing in the world. And they found out that between 1999 and the year 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. Think about that. At that time, technology knowledge was doubling every 2 years. It's now doubling every year. Soon it'll be doubling even more frequently than once a year. So our ideas about curriculum, that is that you somehow have a set of things to know, you divide it up into the 12 years of schooling, feed it to the students and somehow they'll be done, is completely problematic. Definitely the key thing, of course there are ideas and facts and concepts that students need to learn in and between disciplines, but they have to figure out how to learn, how to use their own resources to inquire, investigate, and so on. So that means that we have to think about reform, curriculum, learning, teaching very differently. A number of nations have responded more quickly and more strategically than the United States has, and they've demonstrated what can move a state or a country forward rapidly and purposefully toward greater equity, as well as greater excellence for large numbers of students. And while we hear the PISA comparisons all the time, and Ontario and Hong Kong both do extremely well in those assessments, the big issue in the United States is equity. Our PISA scores are mostly a function of inequality in this country. So that while we score below the sort of international or OECD averages in math, about at the average in science and above the average in reading, the highest performing students and highest performing states in this country do comparably with some of the highest performing nations and jurisdictions. The lowest performing, much less. If we look only at schools that serve fewer than 10% of children in poverty, we would score #1 in the world in reading. But if we look at those schools that have more than 75% of students in poverty, we're sort of 39th or 40th, something like that. The point is that in many developed countries, the inequalities that we experience, first of all, there are many fewer people living in poverty, children, and furthermore, schools are funded more equitably. So these questions about how did nations that were once inequitable, which includes certainly China and Hong Kong in particular, and others achieve greater equity as well as greater quality are also lessons that we should pay attention to. Obviously, we can't migrate lessons wholesale, but we can and should analyze and think strategically about what we want to draw from what other nations have done. And I want to just say a word about some of the lessons from Ontario, Canada, and Hong Kong, China. Canada, of course, always rates in the top 10 nations on PISA. Ontario actually would, if it were pulled out, would be sort of in the very top one or two. It's at one of the most high-achieving parts of Canada, and yet it's one of the most diverse. It is the most diverse state, I believe. And there are more immigrants in Ontario than the proportion of immigrants in our nation. So we often discount other countries and say, well, they don't have the heterogeneity and the immigration and so on that we have. In fact, this is a place that does. They've made the strong gains that Michael talked about through investments in school, leadership, and teaching. They were poised 10 years ago pretty much where the U.S. is now, one could argue. There was a lot of teacher bashing. There was a lot of public school bashing. The frame of reference was punitive. They were concerned about low performance and high dropout rates. And they had to go through a process of repairing relationships with schools, building with teachers and building capacity in schools, in addition to the things that Michael very quickly went through, and we appreciate the speed and alacrity with which you got through a lot of ideas. I just want to mention that they really invested in getting knowledge to teachers and schools through extensive professional development, building a leadership knowledge base and training leaders much more intensively, building networks of schools to learn from each other, creating capacity for researchers and practitioners to work together. They basically took the idea that what will motivate schools is knowing more about how to do the right things and how to do things well, rather than flogging and punishing them into some kind of epiphany to work harder. So huge numbers of strategies for investing in knowledge, skill, and capacity for individuals and for groups of teachers and leaders and schools. In Hong Kong, similarly, as Kai-Ming told it 10 years or so ago, 12 years ago, there was a lot of disgruntlement among teachers about schools and so on. And over the course of many decades, Hong Kong moved from a very unequal elite system. One of the other inheritances from the British system was that there were some highly educated people and lots of uneducated people in Hong Kong. And they created a much more equitable system. And that's a change we need to figure out here. Like the US, there was also there significant dissatisfaction with the effects of testing on learning, and a real exploration of what it means to learn for the 21st century. A shift, as Kai-Ming said, from assessment of learning to assessment for learning. A transformation of an examination system, which was pretty much a traditional British system of examinations, written, not so much the multiple choice approach that we have here, written, open-ended primarily, teachers scoring those examinations, but nonetheless, examinations that said, here's the problem, you find the answer, this many points off for each wrong mark, towards the kinds of assessments that you got a brief glimpse of in that presentation, and a school-based assessment system, which asks students to engage in projects, laboratory work, inquiry, investigations, collaborative work, and those developed and scored as part of the process of a form of accountability in which schools are asked to continually figure out how to look at learning in a much broader conception. Last thing I would like to just point out before we bring Kai-Ming and Michael back up here for some conversation is the great phrase that Kai-Ming used. A nation should think of students as their children. That's a huge ambition, and one that is far from our current context, where many schools are starving, where many students don't even have the basic access to reasonable education resources, where we have reforms that drive out struggling students in order to get scores up, and where many others are subjected to sort of a drill and kill drudgery. So how can we do that? How can we create a nation that would think of students as our children? Kai-Ming and Michael, come on up and we'll see if you can help us find the answers to some of those questions.